Let's do We Are What We Are, which is a remake of the Mexican movie. Do you remember us reviewing this? It came out in 2010. And the Mexican movie is by Michel Grau, and it's a story about a family who, at the very beginning, the patriarch of the family dies, leaving the family to carry on the family tradition, which is, it turns out, is based on cannibalism. And it's set in this sort of, teeming suburbs of Mexico City, and it's a very, very strange film. I mean, some people have called it satirical. I mean, it's only satirical in as much as it has a kind of, socio-political undercurrent, that it's to do with, alienation and poverty in the underclass. So this is a remake by the writer and director of Stakeland. I think this is their third film together, Jim Mickle and Nick D'Amici, and it takes the story and it moves it from Mexico City to the Catskills. And essentially, it rather than simply remaking it, it does that thing that, whenever you hear a remake coming up, everyone says, well, we've tried to reinvent the story. And of course, in terms of horror remakes, this is always really worrying, because the history of horror is littered with what are referred to as foreign language films, like Ringu being remade as The Ring, and, Let the Right One In being remade as Let Me In, and The Vanishing, Spoorloose being remade as The Vanishing. And inevitably what happens in that translation is that it just gets gutted, and you're left with this kind of walking empty husk of a film. In the case of this, they've moved to the Catskills, and the story is changed in many ways. Firstly, they're no longer in, this kind of really, really tight quarters of this teeming domestic environment. Actually, they're out in remote backwoods. Secondly, at the beginning of the film, it's the mother who dies, and it's the daughters who have to pick up the reins and take on the family cannibal traditions. And during the course of the drama, they realise that that's what they've got to do, and they're not best pleased about it. Here's a clip.
You're going to have to take care of them now. You ready for that?
I'm the eldest. That's the way it works. The way it's always worked.
It just doesn't seem fair. None of it.
That's for me to worry about, not you.
What if we refused to do it? We just stopped. He would make us, wouldn't he?
I just want to get this over with. And then we have a whole year to figure something out.
Just wish that we were like everyone else.
Or not.
I think she wants to have a Caesar salad with a light dressing.
So the subject of cannibalism is something which recurs throughout taboo outre cinema. Whether it's Ruggero Deodato, Cannibal Holocaust, or The Cook Thief, his wife and her lover. The Peter Greenaway film. It's something which cinema kind of comes back to. It's like that and vampirism, and zombieism. It's one of the strands which runs through outre cinema. And there was, when We Are What We Are, the Mexican version came out on DVD, there was a thing I said which had a cannibal gore fest, which it wasn't at all. It really wasn't that kind of film. It was a very, very different film. This, similarly, is a very strange creation. Firstly, the film has a very chilly, very it's rainy and drenched in water and misery and tears and sadness. And it is, in many ways, a very, very chilly watch. And the atmosphere of it goes between being, on the one hand, kind of oppressive, on the other hand, actually fairly quite miserable. What they've managed to do is to take the original idea and say, OK, well, let's completely transform it. Let's put it in a different setting. Let's reverse the gender roles of it. And let's make its central concern not to do with sort of the socio-political stuff about poverty, but let's make its central concern fundamentalist religion. Let's build a sort of religion around what it is that this family are doing. Let's tie it into that. So, one of the co-stars of it is Michael Parks, who of course features in Red State, the Kevin Smith movie. And actually, funnily enough, it's closer in terms of being a thematic companion piece to that than it is to the kind of movies you would think about if you start hearing that somebody's that something is a cannibal film. It's got some very strong performances, particularly from the girls in the cast, who are doing this very difficult thing, which is on the one hand having to be sort of sinister and worrying, but on the other hand not falling over into Addams Family cliches. So it's Amber Childs and Julia Garner, both of whom I think are really terrific. Michael Parks is good in almost everything. Bill Sage is the patriarch of the family. I think, again, is very imposing. They sort of dresses in this sort of Civil War fashion. Everything about there's something out of time about them. I think the one misstep that the film makes is that it has these flashbacks to the 18th century to sort of give you a backstory to explain away the birth of the religion to which they are devoted, which now sort of explains what. And the thing about the original was it never did any of that. It deliberately kind of decontextualized it and said, this is just happening, deal with it, and you have to make up your own mind about what the thing's about. And I can see that if somebody wanted to come to that and say, OK, well, we want to reinvent it, we want to do our own thing, what's the thing that the original film didn't do? Well, the original film didn't have backstory, so let's build backstory in. For me, those sequences undercut the good work of the rest of it. Now, I don't think that it in any way matches the sort of the fetid atmosphere of the original. But I mean, I've read some very sniffy reviews of it, incidentally, but I think that what it does do is have an ambitious and fairly honourable bash at taking the central idea of the story and saying, OK, what can we do this? How can we relocate it? How can we realign it? How can we change what it's about while still keeping the sort of, the meat, the gristle? I mean, it's quite often a tough watch. The cleverest thing about it is that you do sympathise with the girls in the family, even as what's going on sort of starts to mount in terms of the kind of the horrific nature of what's going on, because their performances are strong. You do sympathise with their plight. And it's in the same way as a film like, remember, did you see Stoker? Which kind of sort of nods its head to some extent towards the horror genre, but actually is much more to do with the kind of coming of age, kind of empowerment movie. It's got some very witty use of music. It's shot in this sort of rain-drenched, as I said, everything through a veil of tears way. It's getting a fairly small release, and it's coming out on DVD very quickly. But in a week in which there's an awful lot of very middle-of-the-road, very, very mediocre stuff, I think it stood out as being an honourable and worthy attempt to have to take a text and do something interesting with it, rather than just simply go, OK, that worked before, but the problem with it was in a foreign language. Let's just take it, gut it, make everyone speak English, and think that somehow that'll be a better film. It doesn't do that at all. It actually takes a serious bash at doing something with the story.